There'll be a question and answer period at the end of the hour. If you have any questions, please think of them, write them down, and we'll let you answer in the last 10 minutes. That's acceptable.
Well, I'm going to do more questions than that, I hope.
Okay.
I don't think we're going to wait that long.
Mr. Rowland Evans.
For newspapers and radio. Today, the newspaper business is not on the rocks by any means, but in terms of comparison, relatively speaking, newspapers are rather insignificant when one discusses the impact, the influence, when the power of the mass media. It's television. That's where the influence is. And let me just ask at the outset, I'm not going to wait for 10 minutes before the end of this show to start asking questions, and neither are you. I want to go back and forth all the way through here. So let me just ask you quickly. At home and vacations, not here at, well, you are, of course. You're all at your high schools, right? You're all at high school in Wisconsin? How many of you, on the average, and be honest, watch television as much as 30 minutes a day? Hands up. How many watch television as much as 60 minutes a day? Hands up. How many watch television as much as an hour and a half in the average day? Hands up. How many watch television as much as 2 hours a day? And be honest, search your conscience when you answer this question. 2 hours a day. How many, if any, do you think there are in this room? We can all shut our eyes so you won't identify yourselves to your neighbor. How many watch television as much as 3 hours a day? And that's after supper, maybe 7:30 to 10:30 on an average day. Or maybe every other day. How many watch television 3 hours a day? How many watch it 4 hours a day? How do you know? You're shaking. Oh, you mean you don't? Anybody watch television that much? 4 hours a day? All right, 3 hours a day. Most of you sleep, let's say 7 hours, 7 to 8 out of a 24. Let's say 8 hours. Takes time to get ready for bed. You got to brush your teeth and turn the light out and open the window. Let's say 8 hours. You're either going to bed, sleeping, or getting up. 8 from 24 is 16 hours. You watch, say the average person here watches 3 hours, 2.5, 3 hours a day. That is almost, isn't it? It's almost, well, it's at least 20% of your 24-hour day. And of your waking day, 20% of your waking day. 20% of your average waking day when you're not asleep, you're watching television. That's the mass in mass media. Because what you do is what just about everybody I know in this country, and not only here, in Germany, in France, to a lesser extent in England, Japan I can't answer, in the underdeveloped world, of course, to a lot smaller degree, lesser degree. But this is life today. So mass media is not the window to our future. I think mass media is our future. And for an old guy like me, there are some disturbing things about it. I think you all watch television much too much. So, there you are. My children do the same thing. They watch it maybe even more than you do, but I think they watch it much too much. Now, before I get into a little bit of the more frivolous side of this hour we're going to spend together, let me ask you this. Honestly now, be ruthlessly honest. How many of you have read a, quote, serious, unquote, book? By that I don't mean something on the order of Outer Space or E.T. or the Hardy Boys, but a more or less serious book in the last week. Hand up. What did you read? You in the white sweater.
I was reading from the middle of
What?
Chameleon.
The canoeing?
Chameleon.
Chameleon.
Yeah.
Who wrote it?
William Hill.
Very good. Very good. Did you finish it?
No, Jay.
Give me one other. Who else has read a book? What were you reading? What are you reading? Which?
Catch-22.
Catch-22. That's a marvelous book. Marvelous book. those who didn't put their hands up for having read one book or most of one book in the last week, how many have you read? How many of you have read a book in the last 2 weeks? Those who put their hand up first, leave them down. In the last 3 weeks. How many have not read a book in this little seminar we're having, this little love fest between each other, have not read a book in a month? Hands up. I'm not talking about school now, I'm talking about outside of school. Well, that's not bad. That's about 6 out of maybe 60 here, 70, 10%. This is where I think the mass media is a danger to us, to our politics, and to our society. We spend too much time watching, I was going to say frivolous, I'd say watching nothing. Because really so much of television. Now there are some very, very good things on television. How many watch 60 Minutes, for example, on Sunday night? It's well, you like that. That's well worth watching. But how many of you watch soap operas? A lot of soap. My daughter watches soap operas all the time. It drives me crazy. And I think this is where the problem is. Now, let me take this and examine it for a minute from the standpoint of politics and the general composition of society and culture and life that we try to lead in this country. I'm quoting de Tocqueville. And has anybody in this room read parts of de Tocqueville, or all of de Tocqueville? Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French writer who came here in the mid-19th century, early part of the mid-19th century. Has anybody read him? That's sad to me. That's sad to me because de Tocqueville had a genius of expression in describing the United States, what was then a very young, immature country, about 1830, 1835. Read him. If you have a chance, I bet he's in a lot of libraries back home, certainly in school. Read de Tocqueville, how he saw the developing culture and politics and society in the United States. It's brilliant, brilliant reporting. Anyway, he wrote, in 1835, only a newspaper can put the same thought before 1,000 readers at the same time. Now, that's not a very original thought, but it's aptly phrased. Because in those days, and we can go back as little as 50 years, before there was radio and television, the only way to conjoin thoughts that people had in Cincinnati and Stevens Point in Philadelphia and Sacramento, California, where they saw that other people had the same thoughts, that they were following the same thought process, was in the newspapers. Now, that, as de Tocqueville says, only a newspaper can do that. That's power and that's influence. That's the way politics starts. People get the same idea about a man in 1858, for example, Abraham Lincoln. But they don't, there's no way they can spotlight or focus their thoughts that here's a man, Abe Lincoln, maybe he'd be a good presidential candidate in 1860. Now, take that. Only a newspaper can put the same thought before 1,000 readers. And today we have a television, and we have 4 commercial channels. I work part-time for Ted Turner's cable news network, which is a cable television. There are 25 or 30 cable television companies, maybe 125 or 30, I don't know. We have television available from innumerable sources all the time. Think of how one thought put out on television, how many minds, how many pairs of eyes, and how much brain power can be exposed to one thought at the same time over a television tube. Literally 60, 70, 80, 100 million people. Imagine the power of controlling what comes out on that screen. If you think about it, you see why, and I'm now quoting the former editor of the New York Daily News, Mike O'Neill. New York Daily News is, as most of you know, the biggest circulation newspaper in this country. It's having serious economic problems, but it's still publishing. and it sells maybe 1.3 million copies a day. Don't hold me to that figure, it might be more than that. Mike O'Neill said recently, the tendency has been to revel in the power and use to revel in the power and use it freely, this is the power of the press and the media, rather than accept any corresponding increase in responsibility. The extraordinary powers of the media have been mobilized to influence major public issues and national elections, to help diffuse the authority of Congress, and to disassemble our political parties, even to make or to break them. To disassemble the political parties, even to make presidents or to break them. Now, the press, way before television, had enormous power over making and breaking presidents, clearly, but nothing like the incendiary heat of power that television has today. The media now weigh so heavily, media, plural, now weigh so heavily in the scales of power that some political scientists fear we are upsetting the checks and the balances invented by our forefathers. Now, the political party system was not invented by our forefathers. It was invented by politicians who tried to work in the scheme of our constitutional process of electing Congress and electing presidents as it developed in the first 40 years of the Republic. And it was really political parties developed by osmosis. It wasn't until Jackson, who was elected president in, when? When was Jackson elected president? How many seniors do we have in this group? High school seniors. Are you all seniors? How many juniors? Any sophomores? One sophomore. Now, I can't believe that nobody in this room knows when President Jackson was elected president.
1852.
He was. That was his second term. Very good. First term, 1828. 1828 to 1836, Jackson was president. Jackson formed our political parties. He made political parties a fact of our system because he found that the only way an idea that embodies a president, or a president who embodies an idea, or a majority faction or a minority faction in Congress that embodies an idea, high tariffs, low tariffs, an idea today, MX, no MX. The only way you could carry that idea forward was to construct something around it more solid than an individual or two or three individuals, and thereby was born the political party. The political party was born in 1828 in a serious way. The political party machinery, the 4-year system of nominating presidents by party conventions, and so forth, all of which you know. Now we come down. 1828, Jackson took office. Actually, he took office in 1829. He was elected in 28. So that is almost 54, 55 years ago. Today, that political party system, according to Mike O'Neill, to help diffuse the authority of Congress and to disassemble the political parties. This is a major change that is now working because of the power of the media, and that is to say the power of that eye that stares out at us in our living rooms 3 hours a day for the average in this room. Because the eye of the media can capture a huge audience and sell an idea depending on how hard the progenitor of that idea, whether it's somebody, Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, or whether it's Evans and Novak interviewing some a politician on CNN, whether it is Dan Rather with a twist of an eyelid or a smirk on the evening news, and I'm not saying that Dan Rather smirks on the evening news. I could say a Roger Mudd or anybody else who can convey an impression. And that impression hits all of us right here, and we have to be on guard against being exploited and manipulated and being impressed by the way this stuff comes at it. But how can you do that? Now, let us take an example, the most important example, I'd say, in our history in the last 20 years. And most of you don't remember much about it, but take Vietnam. All of you have read something about the Vietnam War. Most of you remember. Do you remember the Vietnam War pretty well, most of you kids? You do, don't you? Nobody remembers the Vietnam War? We got out of there, yeah, I guess you're right, because we got out of there in 73, 74, it's almost 10 years ago. All right, let's take a more recent event. You take somebody out there tell me of an important happening in your life and the political life of this country that came out of television. What is the most important political thing you have seen on television in the last 2 or 3 years? What?
Well, it wasn't the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, what?
I was going to say Watergate.
All right, let's take Watergate. How many of you remember Watergate? Of course, that was pretty much the same time as Vietnam, 73, 74. But let's take Watergate. I'm going to go back to Vietnam because it's easier to make my point, and you've read enough about it. Have you ever seen those pictures of the Marine taking his cigarette lighter and going into a hamlet in South Vietnam with thatched roof, little thatched roof huts, and holding that lighter against the thatch and watching the whole village go up in smoke? You know what I'm talking about? This was in the Vietnam War. Now think of the power. Well, first, assume that happened 50 years ago before we had television. You get a report in your local newspaper from a reporter saying the Marines burned down a hamlet or a village. And unless it's elaborately described in the most emotional detail, it can't come close to the impact on the viewer of watching an American Army sergeant or a Marine take a match or a cigarette lighter and burn down a whole village. Shock. I mean, I watched it. I was in Vietnam reporting. I saw it there, and I watched it back here on the tube. The impact of that electronic impulse is enormous because all you see is the event itself. You don't see the background of who might have been in that village. You don't know what happened before the actual burning was done, whether the people were ordered out or allowed out. You don't have anything like the entire picture of what this is the culminating expression of, this burning down the hamlet. You can't have. You see this whole thing in maybe 30 seconds in the evening news, or 45 seconds. In Watergate, the way the media, the television media, by emphasizing at the top of the news one aspect of a way of looking at a public event, and there is always more than one way to look at a public event. There normally are 3 or 4 or 5. There may be 10 different contestable, debatable ways of looking at a public event. But in Watergate, what happened to some of those people in the White House? John Ehrlichman, how culpable was he? He went to jail. I think he was culpable. But I guarantee you, if the master control at the switch that turned on and off that eye that we watched on how Watergate developed had a strong view as to John Ehrlichman or any of the other major actors in Watergate, I'll leave out Nixon, that they were innocent. A fabrication could have been constructed of playing that story to the American television watcher that could have turned history. And you cannot say that about any other time in the history of the human race, in the development of civilization, when the power to impress by the enormous influence of this media, television, has on people who watch it today. You couldn't have said that, and this is why political parties are becoming disassembled, to go back to Mike O'Neill. If you are looking for a presidential candidate in the time of President Jackson or President Lincoln or President Roosevelt, or say in 1960 Jack Kennedy running against, who did Kennedy run against in 1960? Does anybody know here? Yes, sir.
Nixon?
Right, sir. Ran against Nixon. If you were looking for a candidate as a Democrat, you end up with Kennedy or Republican Nixon. In 1957, 58, 59 leading up, you went to meetings, you went to halls, you sat and you debated your points and you said, Kennedy, I want Kennedy, I don't want Hubert Humphrey because of this, that, and the other thing. This ran through the community. These ideas flowed. There was debate. There was the interlocking competition of ideas in your community. And then one community and another, there's a state convention, the delegates there picked to the national convention, and they're for Kennedy or they're for Humphrey. They argue it out now. Kennedy is nominated in 1960, in my opinion, a very great man, a great man. And I have nothing against Jack Kennedy, I have nothing against Dick Nixon. He was nominated on the Republican side. But what happens today because of the power of the box? We in the press already are starting what is known as the cattle show demonstrations on the Democratic side, leading to the nomination of a presidential candidate in 1984. The cattle show is a display of wares, political wares. All the leading candidates show up. There's so many cattle. And they parade on the stage, and the television captures them for the evening news. And what we see there are 4 or 5 candidates. Today we've got Fritz Mondale, we've got John Glenn, we've got Gary Hart of Colorado, we've got the former governor of Florida, Reuben Askew, we've got the senator from California, whose name is, yes, Alan Cranston. We got a couple of very bright seniors. Senior? Junior. You ought to be a senior. We got a couple of very bright kids in this seminar. We're lucky. I'd like to see more response out there. More response. Alan Cranston, California. So they parade. How do they make the impact on the local communities that are worried about picking delegates next year, not this year? We don't even start picking delegates until a year from now in Iowa, the Iowa caucuses, and then the New Hampshire primary. 1 year from now. What is going to make the impression that is going to nominate John Glenn or Fritz Mondale or whoever it may be are being made in the living rooms every night? So why do you need a political party? Why do you need this process of nominating conventions when, in fact, voters are making up their minds on the strength of what comes over that tube right now, and then throw into that the power of the television commercial? One of the great artisans of television media politics, I'll think of his name in a minute, said the other day, he said, the only thing that matters in a selection of a candidate and how that candidate makes his campaign against his opponent is commercials, television commercials. These are 30-second spots, 60-second spots, 2-minute spots, occasionally a 5-minute spot, and very occasionally, when a candidate isn't too well known, he'll run even a 15-minute biography. But it's the short spot in which the candidate is contrived in a way that we all can see, and we all know it's contrived, but nevertheless it has an enormous impact on us, is contrived to look like the knight in shining armor, and his opponent is made to look like a man who might succeed as sewer inspector, but never as senator or president or congressman. Now these images flash at us over and over again. In the neighboring state of Minnesota, I covered his campaign last fall. A gentleman by the name of Mark Dayton, not much older than some of you, he's about 32 years old, a little older. When you get to be my age, anything under 50 is all the same. It's all the same. I just wish I were back there. Mark Dayton, 32 years old, spends $7.5 million. Running around the state? No, he did that. Putting out literature? No. Engaging in debates on a stage without television? No. In commercials, most of it in commercials that he had made by the greatest experts in television commercial making for political candidates in this country. They came from New York, California, and Mark Dayton is only a conspicuous example, by no means the only example. And Mark Dayton spent $7.5 million because he had never run for anything, not even dog catcher, before he ran for the U.S. Senate, and because he may have spent just a little bit too much in the eyes of some of those worthy burghers and farmers up in Minnesota, he was defeated. That was a fairly close race. David Durenberger, the incumbent, went in. So television is changing our politics, it's changing our presidential elections, and it is to me, it is perhaps not to cite Justice Holmes' great phrase, clear and present danger, it is something that has to be watched by you who are going to get the full force of this as this technology improves. You take the technology of television today in selling political candidates as measured against 10 years ago, and there's no comparison. 10 years ago, they hadn't even figured out that the television commercials were the be-all and the end-all in getting national support. But you see how it has undermined the normal political process, and as Mike O'Neill said, disassembled the political parties. I would like to know from you whether anybody in this room has ever thought of the kinds of things that we're talking about. Has this come up, the power of the media in our political and governmental side of things? Did this ever come up in classrooms? And tell me what is your view of what I'm saying? Speak up so we can all hear you. It's hard. You got to think hard to do this. Do you think I overstate the problem and the danger?
No.
Why?
It's true.
Where do you see it? Where do you come from?
Spencer.
Spencer is what, north, south, east, or west?
It's about 10 miles from Marshville.
10 miles from Marshville. And you see this in congressional races, or do you see it only because you sense it when you watch television in a presidential race? Anybody got a comment on what I'm talking about?
I think a lot of people that vote, they don't put the time in researching the people that are running, so while they're watching TV, if they see somebody, then that name sticks with them when they go to vote.
And that's putting in 3 seconds what I tried to say in 18 minutes and didn't really succeed. Exactly. Yes, sir.
Isn't that kind of a two-way street, though? Because before television, the candidates didn't have the exposure to the people. And you're saying now that television helps them to manipulate the public, but doesn't it also bring the issues into the open?
If it were done, and did you all hear the question? Two-way street, and this brings the issues into the open, and it exposes a candidate to all of us. We can see him, whereas 100 years ago, if you lived across the Alleghenies from Philadelphia, if you lived in Pittsburgh, you never even saw the senatorial candidate in Pennsylvania if he came from Philadelphia, because you couldn't. And the answer is yes, it is a two-way street if you assume that the proprietors, the people who make the television image, are going to do an objective job of it. And of course they're not. Now, Dan Rather and Roger Mudd and the other anchor people and all the local television news people do as objective a job as they can. But you can't, there's no such thing as total objectivity. So the downside of that is, yes, hear these ideas spewing out that politicians are saying they'll deal with, that they will solve unemployment, they will solve interest rates, they will solve the tariff question and protection, and you see this on television, and you wouldn't have seen them, and you wouldn't have heard them say these things if you didn't have television. But how do you separate the fact of what really is inside that candidate and his program, and what he says he is and his program is? You can't do it. So, is it better? I'm very old-fashioned on this. The way Jackson organized the political system was, and it wasn't just Jackson, it developed over the years after 1828, right up to Roosevelt, right up to Kennedy. The political process was in the hands of politicians. Politicians are regarded as dirty people. A lot of people think of politicians as kind of dirty. Well, I don't think politicians are any dirtier, just to use a hackneyed phrase, any less loyal, any less honest, any less desirable as friends than bankers or real estate people or veterinarians. I think they're all pretty much the same. People everywhere, I think, are pretty much the same. Politicians, however, are educated in politics. Dog catchers are educated in catching dogs. And the way the system has worked up until television took over the political party role, that the politicians looked around the country for a presidential candidate starting earlier, and they got together and they talked, and they took the train from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to Milwaukee to Minneapolis, and they talked to their friends out there, and they decided on pragmatic evidence of how a governor was doing on an issue in a farm state. Was he solving that issue? Or how an industrial state senator was dealing with the tariff question. A myriad of little angles and insights and feelings about these candidates. Put this stuff all together, these expert politicians, and they decided who would be the best candidate. And they didn't make us decide. Now that's a terrible thing to say, in a way, because what I'm saying is the democratic process doesn't always work as well as it should. And that maybe you have a political elite, that is to say, men who are spending all their time on politics. James Farley, who was national chairman under the Democrats for Franklin Roosevelt. You could name a dozen who are well known. You're turning over the job of doing our thinking as citizens to them, and that's sacrilegious. You're not supposed to say that. In a democracy, the people choose. But how can the people choose when what they are being given to choose from comes at them in this enormous velocity and intensity of television? How can average voters separate the true from the false? Yes, sir.
I can understand the problem. I mean, you read a book, you watch a movie, you see two different things. When you read a book, you can make your own picture of what you want to see. When you watch a movie, they make that picture for you. So when you have politicians, I think the only way to get around it would be to print facts in magazines, papers, what they have done, not what they promised to do, what they have done. And then people can read and paint their own picture. If they see a person on television, that person comes across as a character or whatever else. A person has to be able to paint their own picture, like reading a book. You have to be able to...
I totally agree with that. I think that's exactly right, but this is why I asked the question, we're coming to you in a second, about reading. Let me ask it directly. How many in this room, students, read a newspaper every day? Well, that's the best. That's the most cheerful news I've had in a week. What newspaper? The Stevens Point newspaper, or the college newspaper here? No, of course not. Not here. Of course, you're not here. What do you read? Your hometown newspaper?
Yeah, state paper.
And you read those who had hands up. You really read that newspaper. I don't mean every word in it. Every day. How many read Time or Newsweek or U.S. News, one of the weekly news magazines, every week? All right. So, if you have, how many of you vote? How many of you are 18 years old? So some of you, did any of you vote last year? Any voters last year? Couple. So you are voters, you're going to all be voters in a year or so, and you do read the newspapers. If you read the newspapers, fine, but I find that with television, a lot fewer people read newspapers. Now, the statistics don't prove that out. The statistics, and I didn't bring them with me, but the statistics show that we have 1,763 daily newspapers today. We had 1,760 10 years ago. Some big papers have died, others are born. But you're right, if the voter takes the time. But you see, the voter today has an out. He says, why do I have to spend all that time reading these statements
That's exactly it.
when I can see what I am voting for by looking at the television screen? And I see Jack Kennedy, go back, I see Ronald Reagan, and you know, I don't know much about that fella, but I like the way he handles himself. I like the way he looks, you know. Aunt Mary, did you see that nice little smile he had? And then they look at Jimmy Carter, and incidentally, the one great thing that Jimmy Carter did as president was, and you're going to see the President Ford here in a minute, that after Jimmy Carter, you got to say that he did accomplish one thing. He made Jerry Ford look like a great president, and that wasn't easy. Well, you're going to hear President Ford here in a minute, and you'll see. Jimmy Carter, he's got some funny look in his eye. Aunt Mary, I just can't stand him. Well, that's the way he comes over the tube, but that doesn't tell what's here or here, and they don't read it because it's there for free on television. So this is why I think it's a danger. Yes, sir.
Well, we have the problem, but what's the solution? This works. You can't expect it.
I don't think there is a solution except education, scrupulously, ruthlessly tough individual attention on an individual basis to this problem. Because otherwise, I may be talking total nonsense, and I can't prove any of this, but otherwise I think in 20 or 30 or 40 years we're going to find that the political process is wholly, relatively speaking, wholly within the province of television to tell us what to think. And yes, sir.
Because the problem is, part of the world today is the way it's changing. You got
A little louder so they can hear.
everything is
The world is changing today.
It's changing. We're all sped up, and people don't have the time to read newspapers and stuff. So when it is easy for them,
Now,
they simply take that way out.
the television.
As the world is changing today, for example.
That the world is too much with us, getting and spending, that kind of
Right.
thing. We just don't have time. But we just discovered here that the average number of hours, maybe in this room, is 3 hours of television. If you just took half of that and put it on reading, wouldn't that be a partial answer?
True, but there's many other aspects of life that are, we have a fast-paced society, and there's always something going on.
Well, I agree with that. And we can travel anywhere we want, if we can afford it. We can get to the fishing pond in a car today, whereas 50 years ago you had to walk or ride a horse. Maybe you didn't want to do that. A little bit too much work. Now you just take a car. I agree with that. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't there like a subconscious effect from TV too? Like you said, that, you know, maybe you judge on their appearance, like you noted their smile, but even if you don't, isn't there something that kind of sits in the back of your mind, so when you're voting, even though you don't consciously, like a commercial, kind
The
of,
subliminal
so there's
impact.
more to TV than just what the outside, you know.
I totally agree. I think so, and you're not even aware of it half the time. Let me give one other example outside of politics. And this is a sensitive, it's a sensitive issue in a way, but it's there, might as well face it. Take the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Now we saw, after the Israeli attack, the bombing attack, and I was up there in late June. I didn't get all the way to Beirut, but I got beyond Sidon and Tyre, and almost up to Damour. and I saw the devastation. But of course, in Beirut, the devastation that I saw entire, and Timor was nothing. Beirut was, large parts of it were destroyed. Now, we saw that on our television screens every night. The Israeli government has arranged panels of experts from Israel to come over here, and they're going around this country today explaining how Israel was badly treated by the American television and also newspaper and periodical media, in the way Israel was made to look like a vengeful, murderous country. Now, did any of you see any of the TV of the bombings in Beirut last fall? How many here, hands up, who saw something on television showing Israel bombing Beirut? I am amazed you all didn't. I am amazed that anybody in this room could have escaped that, because it was on day after day after day. Now, yes?
Does government politics have a lot of influence on the media as to what gets...
I just wanted to make one point on this. I just wanted to make one point. If you knew that, if you saw on your screen and you heard Dan Rother saying, and Israel unleashed 28 bombers for the 4th straight day at what apparently is an unprotected civilian residential area, and here is the result, and you saw this terrible damage, and you saw the babies being carried out, etc. You get one image, and that image is Israel is doing something bad, and they should stop. But what if you discovered that in the a subterranean, huge subterranean situation underneath some of these so-called houses, apartments, there was stored an enormous amount of PLO bombs, PLO weapons. And we don't know that. And I'm not saying that this is a fact, but it could easily have been a fact, and the Israelis claim that in many cases this was true. Now imagine you see on your television screen, the first thing you see is the planes coming over, and then you cut after the action is ended, and the camera zeroes in on this subterranean cavern underneath a building that's been demolished, and there are tanks and weapons, other kinds of weapons and carbines and ammunition and detonators, etc., that were gathered by the PLO to be used against Israel. You have a totally different image. That's an explanation for the Israeli action. Now, I'm not saying that I can point to this as a fact. I mean, this is what the Israelis claim. But this is the power of the medium. Who makes the decision to send somebody in there and follow it up to the point of seeing, is this action by Israel somehow explicable? Does it have some... Well, that is the power of... In the press, you'd never get that, because the newspaper reporter is going to go in there. He's not working under the press of time. He has all the time he needs, and he can write a story a week after the event. But television, that story of the Israeli attack is dead the next morning. It has to go on that night, and you got 1 minute to put it on. And that's translating the effect on politics into the effect on foreign policy. Yes?
Isn't that what TV does best, though? Brings the breaking events?
Yeah, TV?
Yeah, where you're expected then after the event is done to go back and read.
The trouble is, that is absolutely right. And listen, if I may coin a phrase, some of my best friends are in the television business. So I'm not trying to knock the whole television business. I'm in it myself. But there are elements that are very unhealthy. Now, I'll give you an example. Remember the story about 2 weeks ago of a young man who, either because it was a nuclear issue, or he was for a freeze, or he was against Weinberger on nuclear, I don't remember what it was, but he threatened to burn himself. He threatened to burn himself up, and he called a TV station. And the TV sent a camera around, and sure enough, he burned himself. And I don't know whether he survived or not. He was very severely burned, over 80% of his body, and he was taken to the hospital. TV is a magnet that makes appealing, that makes incidents like this, events like this, immensely appealing to those who want attention. And I have no doubt I mean, I've seen it myself. I've seen it in Vietnam where a TV camera would come up to a group of peasants and maybe an army sergeant and try to create a problem. So you could get that picture showing the brutality of the American forces in Vietnam, or conversely, how the sergeant was being hoodwinked by the farmers. I don't know. The point being that television invites all kinds of manipulation by those who think they can get televised and think they can get on the screen. So I'm guilty of a lot of hyperbole, what I'm saying here, I'm sure, but what I'm simply trying to leave you with is that I don't think of the communications explosion just as mass media as a window to our future as well as our present. I really think that this is a profound revolution that and I don't pretend to be an expert in it. I don't have time to study the way this should be studied. Other people do, and you can, there's some classics that have been written on it. I guess all I'm saying is I don't think it's just a window. I think mass media and this revolution of communications is our future. And it's not it goes into the whole question of what happens when we marry computers and mass media, which is being done right now, where I can get my television, I can get a printout of the stories I want by just pushing a button on my computer and having those stories come in over my television set and press another button to a printer and the stuff is printed right there. I could do that today if I had the money to buy the equipment. 20 years will all happen. That this centralization of all our thinking, and we're susceptible to it. I mean, we all know about mass hysteria and how it happens. We all saw what Hitler did in Germany. These are profoundly disturbing things for a know-nothing like me, who's been just a reporter for 40 years and sees these revolutionary things. I don't know how we're going to handle them in this country. Yes, sir.
Isn't it our fault, though, for watching this stuff? It's not
Well, it's hard not to. I mean, I do a lot of polling, and I usually poll as a reporter with Pat Caddell. I go with 3 pollsters, professional pollsters, Pat Caddell. They work for Pat Caddell. Pat Caddell is a pollster in Washington who was responsible for George McGovern getting nominated in '72 and for Jimmy Carter being elected and nominated and elected in 1976. He's a very wise person and a very young person. He's still only about 31 years old, but I go polling with him. Now we poll from 2 in the afternoon till 9 at night. And so help me, and this could be a hamlet in New Jersey, it could be a slum in Philadelphia, it could be out here, and I polled in Wisconsin, I polled in Minnesota, Iowa, farm. It's you go from house to house and you knock on the door and the farm wife or the farmer comes and you stand there and you ask him 30 questions, usually on a presidential election. But the point of the story is not the polling technique, it is what you see in the houses. And what you see invariably, I don't think I have ever been in all the polls I've done, that I've walked into a living room and not seen at least one television screen on full blast. Any time of the morning, noon, or night. And normally we poll from about 2 till 10. And of course, a lot of that time is the evening news time. But then you hear another set upstairs, and these are lower middle income houses. We're not talking about the rich. We're talking about lower middle income. And everybody is glued to that. You say, no, they don't have to do it. But there is a narcotic effect of entertainment. I can even see it in my own wife. Sometimes before we go to bed, she'll turn on Channel 26 and get some Masterpiece Theater. It's pretty good stuff. If you have the time to watch it, I'd love to watch Masterpiece Theater. I like to watch Johnny Carson. I think he's great. But there's a narcotic effect if you let yourself get hooked. And I'd say anybody who watches television 3 hours a day, I would say they're hooked. I really would. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
like, when you say some of the problems with more or less the news would be that people like to see the lighter side of things, where they take a minute with the bombings and stuff, but they'll take like 3 or 4 minutes to talk about, you know, President Reagan going to his ranch, or
Yes.
someone with the divorce court or something.
Yeah.
Whereas they don't take a story and go in depth with it to show us really what is going on.
That's right. Very seldom. Not on the evening news show. Now, you can get that if you watch Ted Koppel on Nightline at 11:30 at night in Washington. You can get one story in depth for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe even a half an hour. If you watch McNeil and Lehrer, you'll get one story in depth. But that's only one story, and that's 5 a week. That's only 5 a week. There are 100 every day that should be that you can't get on television. You have to get out of a good newspaper. Yes, sir.
Well, isn't it the environment and the attitude of the person? He can choose to watch TV as long as he wants to, or he can turn it off and read a book, and it's up to him. So it's really
Absolutely.
the fault of the person
Absolutely.
watching the TV or reading the book.
Absolutely. But I ask this question then. How many of you who watch television 2, 3, 4 hours a day ever ask yourselves the question, am I spending too much time watching the box? Be honest now. How many people ask yourself? How many of you ask yourself that? But you keep on doing it?
Yeah.
Or do you not? Do you deny yourself the...
You'll stop for like a day or two, and you'll go back to it again.
You see, it's like giving sugar up for Lent. But people don't give up anything for Lent. Does anybody here give up anything for Lent? That's very encouraging. Very encouraging. I guess if there's a message in this madness that I've been giving you, and I'm not good at messages, but I guess it's this, and you put it exactly right. Discipline. Who said that? You did. That the requirements in growing up today of discipline are so much greater, I guess, not having lived in 100 years ago, than they ever have been before. And this is why the distractive aspects of modern life, which is focused and centered on the mass media, is the worst of them and the most dangerous of them. And we have so much at our beck and call today. You, me, all of us, compared to any other time in history, that to me, it's a bit frightening, and I think self-discipline is the answer. Absolutely. Yes, sir.
It's not only going to be discipline, but it's also going to be, we're going to have the maturity to evaluate what we watch on the TV. We have to sit down, we have to watch it, we have to think it through. We can't just watch and accept what we see. We have to evaluate and see what they're trying to get across to us, if what they're trying to get across is a true fact, or if they're trying to manipulate us in some way. We have to have the maturity.
And that takes another kind of mental discipline, not discipline to turn off the set, but when you're watching a commercial which is selling Ronald Reagan in 1984 for a second term, and you see Reagan saying, and I ended inflation so that all you good housewives out there, your hard-working husbands, could go to the store and get $1 worth of groceries for $1, that you think to yourself, yeah, and how much unemployment did you give us while you were... This is the kind of counteraction. I'm not saying this to knock Reagan or to praise Reagan. I'm just saying it's a good example that when you see that you're disciplined enough to make yourself think, what are you really seeing? You're seeing one side of a very complicated story told in a sulphurous, sweet, delicate way that doesn't tell the whole story.
Wouldn't the other candidates' commercial then bring out the bad things?
Oh, sure. Yeah, maybe you don't see it that day, but then when you do, you make the same. Any questions? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
TV has its good effects too. I'd like to know if the good outweighs the bad, or does the bad outweigh the good?
Well, I think of course, television has opened, the television age has opened a whole new era to people who have the opportunity to watch it. In this country, it's done incredibly good things. The trouble is that to see the really good stuff that is on television, And there's some very, very good things on television. You have to be there at the right time. And often, the very best things are shown at the very worst hours, because the best hours for catching a large audience, clearly, are saved for the hot news shows and the whatever dramatic situations there are that you can throw onto a television. But I mean, watching an operation, I mean, I saw that heart operation. I don't know how many of you saw that. I thought that was fabulous television. It made me a little bit ill to watch it, but I managed to watch most of it. And I think that in learning how our technology works, television, I'm not an expert, I don't watch that much television, but I mean, there are ways you can really teach yourself, almost get a full education, and that's very healthy. I'll tell you the thing that I've done, and I'm sure maybe some of you have it at home, is to get a box that can record certain shows. Does anybody have one of those boxes? They're really tremendous. I got one for Christmas from my wife, and once you learn how to work it and set it, you can record those shows. They're really good stuff. And it's not just paparazzi, it's not just drama, it's Pavarotti, it's not just theater of the air, etc. I mean, there is a tremendous amount on ecology, environment, nature, how to protect your house from fires. I mean, all this is available on television. And when the full impact of cable is when that matures, it's going to be quadrupled the amount of stuff that is available. But I think that most people don't. I think most people watch sports, they watch the news, and watch a few good topical shows like 60 Minutes, and then the soap operas. Question, we got about 2 minutes. Yes, sir.
Do you think it's a good idea for cable to come about like that? I mean, for cable to come to like smaller towns and become popular instead of having your basic 3 channels, you know what I think?
Oh, I think absolutely. Yes, I'm all for cable. And not just because our outlet happens to be cable, but I'm all for it because I think that the more you disseminate the transmission, the power at the transmitting end, the more you get away from this total control of our whole society and our culture and our politics by 3 little networks. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm going into journalism after high school, and I had a difficult time making up my mind whether it would be broadcast journalism or, for a magazine or newspaper. I want your opinion of where you think.
Well, I'm very prejudiced, but I'll give it to you. I am very prejudiced. I think television journalism, is by far the better opportunity if you want to get rich, if you want to make a lot of money, if you want to. There are very few top jobs that offer this, but if you hit the top, either at a local station in a fairly good-sized city, or in Washington or New York with one of the networks, you're going to really hit the gravy, ride the gravy train. But in terms of fun and challenge and real contribution, I don't think there's any comparison. I remember when I was working for the AP, and in those days, radio, this is 1945 and 6, 7, radio worked this way. Radio newscasters took the AP radio news wire out of New York and Washington and flicked it off and read it. Just read it. And they got paid enormous amounts of money for reading the news. We collected the news. And we were the reporters in Washington who collected the news, and we sent it to the radio stations over our wire. And we got the minimum wage. And I didn't mind that. I didn't mind that at all, because I would rather be paid a minimum wage and do work that is really challenging and rewarding, that is, leg work as a reporter, than sit in an insulated, air-conditioned radio station and tear off the copy and read somebody else's reporting. And we used to think, how crazy this is. We're supplying the raw material, and they're turning out the finished product and getting an enormous amount of money for it. Also, I don't think that there are exceptions to everything. Just run-of-the-mill I think that the television guys don't have nearly the chance, even the good television reporters in a big city or in Washington, New York, I don't think the television guys have a chance to do anything like the kind of investigative reporting that the average newspaper man does, because he's not working. He's working on a deadline, but he's not working on camera all the time. His job is to produce a lot of hard facts, hard to get facts, and then write a story. The man who's on the microphone or on the television screen, that's his big thing, is sitting there and being an actor, in effect, giving the news. And I think the opportunity for broadening the mind and learning about politics and life are much greater in newspapers and television. But as I said, I'm totally prejudiced. Question? Yes, ma'am.
But we're running 5
We
minutes late.
get one quick one here.
Are there going to be jobs in the newspaper business?
The newspaper business, as I said, it seems to be failing, is doing better profit, from the standpoint of financial profit today than it ever has. There is more advertising in newspapers than all television and radio put together, by far. The jobs in newspapers may not be quite as prolific as they were 10 years ago. I don't know, because there have been so many mergers. But I would say that this is a very fruitful time to go into the newspaper business.